My name's Luke Malone. I'm a journalist who reports on sexual abuse and harassment with a focus on child sexual abuse and prevention. I work for outlets including Time, The Washington Post, Slate, Gimlet Media, This American Life, and The Atlantic, among others. And a documentary I produced on sexual abuse within the family will be airing on HBO later this year. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today to the first discussion in our three-part series, Conversations on the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse. This Hopkins at Home series, sponsored by the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse and the JHU Alumni Relations Office of Lifelong Learning, will feature faculty from the Bloomberg School of Public Health discussing their groundbreaking work on child sexual abuse prevention. We encourage you to participate in our live Q&A session by leaving your questions and comments in the chat feature below, which we will answer toward the end of today's session. Today's conversation, titled Child Sexual Abuse is Preventable, Not Inevitable, How the Moore Center Pursues Its Mission, will introduce the field of child sexual abuse prevention, discuss the public health approach to prevention, share examples of promising interventions, and the Moore Center's groundbreaking efforts to create a safer future for all children. It's now my huge pleasure to introduce our featured speaker for today's presentation, my friend and colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau. Elizabeth Letourneau is a professor and interim chair of the Department of Mental Health and the director of the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. For 35 years, she's focused on child sexual abuse prevention, practice, and policy. Elizabeth's work has garnered approximately $35 million in grants and gifts and has resulted in more than 100 scientific papers and chapters and one book, soon to be 2 books. She's an internationally recognized expert in child sexual abuse prevention and advises the CDC, the European Commission, the World Bank, and other government and big tech entities focused on preventing child sexual exploitation and abuse. Her research on sex offender registration has been cited in several state Supreme Court cases, by state legislatures, and by the American Law Institute in their revised Model Penal Code. Elizabeth is a 222 recipient of the Association for the Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Abuses Lifetime Significant Achievement Award. And Elizabeth and I are also currently co-authoring a book about child sexual abuse prevention and the history of US sex crime laws, which will be published by Basic Books, an imprint of Ashed. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to discussing your work and that of the center.
I am too, Luke. I am just delighted to be here, and it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, same, likewise. So yeah, let's get into it. So today's going to be, for everyone at home, today's going to be kind of just more of a conversation between Elizabeth and I, something a bit more informal, which I think is more enjoyable for us and certainly hopefully you as well. So Elizabeth, to start, I mean, we met way back in 2012, like just over a decade ago, which feels wild, when I was writing a story about young self-identified pedophiles who wanted help dealing with their attraction to other children. And at that time, the Moore Center had only recently launched, I think just maybe 3 to 6 months prior. So like, take us back to that time, like, you know, now that 10 years have passed, I'd like to look back. What was the Moore Center's mission at that time?
You know, as you said, we launched the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse in 2012 with generous funding from Dr. Stephen and Mrs. Julia Moore. So Steve Moore studied preventive medicine at Hopkins, and he was motivated to form the center by the lasting devastation of child sexual abuse, which had been perpetrated against his sisters by a relative. And he recognized that punishment of their offending relative, however deserved that may have been, would have done little, if anything, to improve life for his families or for other families. So protecting children from experiencing harm in the first place became Steve's mission, which is our mission and our vision. So the Moore Center's vision, shared by the Bloomberg School of Public Health and the university, is a world without child sexual abuse. And our guiding principle is that child sexual abuse is preventable, not inevitable, that everybody shares in prevention and that we all benefit when children remain safe from abuse.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I think for many of us, and certainly myself way back then, I'd only ever kind of conceived of child sexual abuse as a criminal justice problem issue, right? And it's not lost on me that the Moore Center is housed at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. So like, how does child sexual abuse relate to public health specifically?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to say, we have to situate prevention within the broader, more comprehensive landscape of addressing and preventing child sexual abuse by focusing on prevention, healing, and justice. So by healing, we refer to people who have survived child sexual abuse, justice, holding people, particularly adults, accountable for the harm they've caused to children. But we've really not focused much on prevention. That's not just you, Luke, that's everybody, including myself until a while ago. Steve's vision for situating our center here at Hopkins was to really bring this prevention focus to the field of child sexual abuse. But most folks really can't envision what preventing child sexual abuse would look like. So when I talk with people about this, I like to bring in examples that we are all familiar with. So easy and obvious examples of public health prevention approaches. These include, at Hopkins, for example, these include things like the infant car seat, or latex gloves used by healthcare professionals, or the polio vaccine. So each of those are easy and obvious solutions to problems that none of us even really thinks about today, but they all faced a lot of resistance back in the day, and they all required real resources to get developed. To talk a little bit just for a moment about the pushback against those, physicians and nurses initially, many of them really balked at using rubber gloves back then. Some were allergic to the rubber, which makes sense. But a lot of healthcare professionals felt that even a thin barrier between them and their patients was disruptive to the practitioner-client relationship. In terms of the baby car seat, I mean, my own parents, we have kids in my family that span 23 years, and so when the first 4 of us were born, car seats were not the law of the land. But when our sister came along, they were, and my parents hated those things. And they just thought, oh, you all were fine without them. She'll be fine if we don't use it. Nobody feels that way anymore. And with polio vaccines, of course, there's always been people skeptical of vaccines, although fortunately, most of us accept the promise of vaccines over the threat of disease. And when we think about child sexual abuse, I honestly believe, I am confident that in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll have solutions that prevent the onset of harmful sexual behavior, that prevent child sexual abuse, that seem as easy and obvious then as these solutions seem to us now.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I remember when we first met, you had said, it sounds like we're on target, right? Because you said at the time we were about 20 years out from these kinds of things being kind of developed and accepted and kind of disseminated. And I was like, 20 years is a long time, but we're like over the halfway mark. So that seems on track. And did it with the car seats. I remember like rolling around in the back of my parents' Volvo as a kid. I'm only 42, but yeah, so car seats were around. Even in Australia where I grew up, that wasn't the norm. And I do want to ask you basically what prevention looks like in terms of child sexual abuse and what might be coming down the pike. But I'd like to go back, because you mentioned that even for you, that prevention, it's funny that you kind of head up this center dealing with prevention of child sexual abuse, and the fact that it isn't something that you kind of started your career out thinking about. I'd just like to kind of ask you, like, how did you start your career? Because I mean, I know you, so it's kind of a bit of a false question. But like, you started dealing with a lot of people who had caused sexual harm already. And so I'd be very curious to know how you kind of went professionally from dealing with people who had perpetrated sexual harm to looking at prevention and having that be your main focus.
Sure. I think happily today there's all kinds of schools of public health, that are popping up around the world, departments, schools that have this real strong focus on prevention. But I was trained, and many of the people in my field were trained initially as clinical psychologists. And so there you're working at the back end of the issue, right? You're working with people who have already caused harm. In my case, I had a great opportunity early in graduate school to co-lead a treatment group for men who had sexually abused children. And what that was a real defining moment for me. I didn't go to graduate school to become, to focus on child sexual abuse. But in that moment, what I recognized was a couple things. One is that these were people. We think of people who sexually abuse children as monsters, as very different, as other, not like ourselves. And we think of them as people whose behavior is unpredictable and unpreventable. But when you sit in a room with 8 guys who have done this, you recognize that even the ones that you don't really like they are in fact still people. And many of them felt very remorseful, were committed to not offending again, wish they hadn't done it in the first place. And you recognize a real potential for reducing recidivism or reoffense rates. And so that's why I focused a lot of my career on early on, was developing and validating treatment programs, looking at and addressing recidivism rates and those sorts of things. But pretty quickly also got interested in policy evaluations. What works to prevent reoffending? And that was a short step to then looking at what works to prevent harm from occurring in the first place. And Luke, you introduced me to a young person who has sexual attraction to children, was committed to not harming kids, and wanted to help others who had had the same experience of having this attraction, didn't want the attraction, didn't ask for it, didn't want to act on it. And that was really the first time I started thinking about people who have not caused harm, who might be at risk to do so, but who don't want to, and really focusing on how do we help them? How do we prevent perpetration from happening? To the extent that the US and other countries have had a focus on prevention, it's really been focused on teaching kids to prevent harm from happening to them. So we have school-based programs that many of us were exposed to that teach kids, or try to teach kids, to recognize, resist, and report abuse. And those programs can be helpful in terms of uncovering ongoing abuse and giving kids some agency, but children by and large don't have the agency to keep themselves safe in this way. We really have to focus on adults and people who may be at risk of causing harm, or who are in a better position to intervene.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned juveniles, and I think many people listening today, some of you in the audience might well know, and many might not. When I first heard this statistic, I was quite taken aback, and just the sheer prevalence of sexual harm perpetrated upon kids is often at the hands of other kids just a few years older than them. And please correct me, you're like the scientist, like you're the researcher. So is it like upwards of 70%, over 70%, correct?
Yeah, in the United States, when we do nationally representative surveys of large samples of people, what we find is that about 70% of individuals who survive child sexual abuse say that it was at the hands of another child under the age of 18, and usually just a couple or 3 years older than they were. And that figure has been replicated very recently in Australia, with 65% of survivors reported that their abuse was at the hands of another child. And so focusing prevention efforts on kids, and particularly pubescent kids around the ages of 10, 11, 12, 13, middle school age kids basically, is going to be a key strategy for preventing the onset of harmful sexual behaviors.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, just to kind of strip it back a little bit, this word prevention, right? And I think, like many of us, again, myself included, especially at the beginning when I started kind of working in this area from a journalistic perspective, again, it was from a criminal justice perspective. And I think I can speak for both of us when I say that criminal justice is a really important component of dealing with child sexual abuse, but it's not the only component. And I think I thought of prevention of kind of holding people who've perpetrated harm accountable in a criminal justice sense. But when we talk about prevention, like that's after harm has already been caused to one or more children, correct? So when we speak about prevention, like I think it gets thrown around, like what does this look like in the contents of child sexual abuse? Or what could that look like? And specifically, what is the Moore Center's role in this?
Sure, and you're right. Justice is a key part of the prevention, healing, and justice comprehensive approach to child sexual abuse. It is where we put most of our resources. And you and I co-published a paper where we showed that the United States annually spends about $5.4 billion to incarcerate people for sex crimes against children. So $5.4 billion every year. And that's based on government figures. And right now we spend $3 million to support child sexual abuse prevention research. So that's a vast difference. We really need to grow the resources that we put towards prevention. At the Moore Center, one of our key strategies is to develop and test prevention interventions. And so we've developed 2. One is focused on middle school age kids. So we call this a universal prevention program, because it's for all kids, boys and girls who are in 6th, 7th, maybe even 8th grades. And the focus there is really teaching these kids who are right at the cusp of puberty, beginning to start experimenting with sexual behaviors, why they shouldn't involve younger kids in sexual behaviors at all, and how to avoid involving peers in coercive sexual behaviors, non-consenting sexual behaviors. So it's a school-based intervention. We did a pilot test with 4 Baltimore City public schools, including the school that my own children went to, and found that kids learned the concepts, which is great, but even more importantly, that they reported higher levels of behavioral control. They felt confident that they were going to be able to avoid engaging younger kids in sexual behavior or engaging peers in harmful behavior than the comparison group of kids who hadn't yet gotten the intervention. So sort of school-based universal prevention programs, there's a couple of others that are also very effective, have been shown to be very effective at preventing the onset of harmful sexual behavior towards peers. That's a really important area of growth right now. That looks at all kids, right? So you don't take consideration of any risk. It's just kids are at risk because they're young and dumb. They don't know the rules yet. So we need to be more explicit about why they need to avoid engaging with younger kids, or how to engage with peers in a way that is consenting and mutual. But you also want to develop prevention programs that target people who are might be at risk for offending. And for us, we have an online prevention program that we developed and launched called Help Wanted. And Help Wanted is for people who have sexual attraction to children and who want help navigating that attraction, and also help living with that attraction, even if they're not offending and are never going to offend. It's a highly stigmatized characteristic to be born with or to acquire early in childhood, which is how we think sexual attraction develops. Either it's something that you're born with, or something that gets acquired very early on. And it's possibly the most stigmatized characteristic you could have. And so Help Wanted, we developed it with input from survivors of sexual abuse and their allies, with therapists who work with people who have offended, with other preventionists, with law enforcement, people at Interpol who have expertise in child sexual abuse, and a host of other colleagues, and launched Help Wanted as just a 100% self-help intervention. So you go to it and you can pull down any of the 5 modules that you want. There's a resource page. It's free. It's online. So we launched that in May of 2020. And since that time, so almost exactly 3 years ago, since that time, more than 515,000 people have visited that website, and more than 50,000 people have gone into the modules to actually take the courses. We've gotten a lot of feedback. The feedback has been largely positive, but we did modify it. And now we have funding from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention to test this in a randomized controlled trial to see, does this intervention do what we want it to do? Does it give people the skills, tools, knowledge to avoid harming others? And does it also help them achieve the health and happiness that we all deserve?
Yeah. And not to get too into the weeds, but how can you measure that? How can you measure the success of something like Help Wanted?
Yeah, how do you measure the absence of something? Not easily, especially in an online context. So we have worked very, very hard to identify and to create outcome measures, measures, self-report instruments that measure things like, how confident do you feel? What's your self-efficacy to avoid engaging in harmful behavior? Have you offended or not? We use well-validated measures of mental health and well-being to assess the other outcomes that we're interested in, assessments of suicidality. But we do rely on self-report. And you could be forgiven for thinking that self-report by people who have sexual attraction to children might not be 100% honest, or self-report about illegal behaviors and seriously illegal and immoral behaviors of sexually abusing children might not be 100% accurate. What we do know is that when you ask questions in a way that is safe and respectful, people do largely respond honestly. We know it's not 100%. We also know that more people will self-acknowledge engaging in harmful behaviors than we'll ever see using arrest records, right? Very few people are arrested for these kinds of crimes. Those are important. That's an important set of data, an important source of data, but it doesn't really give you, it's not sensitive enough to measure an intervention outcome. So rely on self-report. If we were doing an in-person intervention, which there are in-person interventions for people at risk of offending, we could maybe also include other reporters like spouses or family members. But for our online intervention and also for our school-based intervention, we focus mostly on self-report. With the school-based, we can get teacher report as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I want to go back to something you said earlier in our chat about monsters, and it kind of relates to this. I think some people might be listening. They might be thinking like, oh, it's like giving help to people with an attraction to children might just sound icky or just too much, right? Like lock them all up, even though that's not a really very realistic thing, because no one's going to line up for involuntary preventive detention. But so like when I first started working in this field, like I mean, actually, the idea of people with risk factors, right, that predispose them to potentially causing sexual harm, be they adults or other kids. Like, I think we have this idea of people who commit sexual offenses or who are at risk of perpetrating these harms as monsters who are doomed to offend and and whose behaviors can't be prevented. How, as you mentioned, like in my own journalistic work with people with a sexual attraction to children who didn't want to cause harm, mostly hadn't caused harm for the most part, and didn't want to. I really got a good chance. I was kind of speaking to, like I've spoken to well over 100, maybe 100, 200 people now with a pre-existing attraction to kids who do not want to cause harm to kids. And I realized, these are people, as you said, they deserve happiness. And also, like, they deserve the help that's going to assist them in preventing kind of perpetrating harm, right? So to bring it back to the monster narrative, with this kind of othering of people who are either at risk or have caused sexual harm, do you think that this monster narrative gets in the way of prevention?
I really do. And actually the next Hopkins at Home event is going to be led by my colleague and friend, Rebecca Fix, and she's going to talk about our research in that area. So I don't want to give too much of that away, but, I like to share this anecdote from someone who you all know, Patty Wetterling. So Patty Wetterling is a mom, and tragically, back in 1989, one of her children was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. It was absolutely a tragic, just the worst possible, obviously the worst possible type of crime. And this was in Minnesota, and when the child was kidnapped, all of Minnesota came out to search for this child and to search for the kidnapper. Right? Like, it was absolutely a massive effort to try to find Jacob Wetterling and try to find the man that kidnapped him. And she talks about how everybody wanted to help find this person, and nobody wanted to find him in their family, in their congregation. Nobody wanted to find him close. And the reality is people who engage in these behaviors are close. We know them. They're in our families. They're in our communities. They are people we may respect, we may love. And when we persist in this idea that people who engage in these behaviors are monsters, it means that we can't see them. And so Larry Nasser can offend against hundreds of girls and women because people couldn't see that he was doing it because he was so respected. Jerry Sandusky could offend against dozens, perhaps hundreds of boys, despite really clear evidence that these things were happening, because he was friendly and he ingratiated himself with family members. People loved him. Mm-hmm. So we've got to get beyond. We should always keep in mind that abuse is intolerable. Abuse of adults against children is absolutely intolerable, and it needs to be punished. People need to be held accountable. At the same time, we've got to get away from this idea that it is only committed by three-headed monsters, because we will just then never see it. And we will have a much harder time intervening early before something has become abuse. Your friend who's a teacher, if you're a teacher, watching that friend violate a bunch of boundaries and not reporting it because you just can't believe he or she is heading down that road. That's a problem. Yeah.
I think percentages also help. They help me kind of get things in my head and kind of stick there. And I think is it 95% of detected sex crimes against children are by somebody known to the child, like be it a sibling, a stepfather, a sports coach, not a stranger. Like stranger attacks are exceedingly rare by comparison. Correct?
Yeah, they're less than 10%. You're absolutely right. And right, child sexual abuse can be perpetrated by virtually anybody. And, in Maryland, we just had the release of the grand jury report that documented yet again a large scale cover up of abuse by priests against hundreds of kids, or at least 150, I think, children or more. And, in addition to sort of shifting away from a monster narrative, we also have to recognize that there are institutional factors that we need to address, not just individual factors. So most people who sexually abuse children do not have sexual attraction to children, strong sexual attraction to children. So I think many people confuse pedophilia or attraction to children with sexual abuse of children. So certainly we know there's many people who have this attraction who don't act on it, but many people who do act against children don't have this attraction. And one thing that we know facilitates that kind of harm is impunity, the sense that your employer, your institution is not going to hold you accountable, is going to just allow you to have access, unmonitored access to children. And if abuse is happening, will turn a blind eye, or worse, will help you evade accountability. And so that absolutely needs to be, and to continue to be, a focus as well.
I we're about to go into a Q&A soon, so I want to give us time to speak to the people who are watching, but I do want to just separate real quick this idea of people with an innate attraction to children and people who perpetrate sexual harm against kids who don't have a pre-existing attraction to kids. Because I think they're two distinct groups, and I think it's very hard for a lot of people to kind of conceptualize. I do have like an elevator pitch, but do have like a really nice, succinct way of kind of explaining the two different kinds of groups.
Yeah, I think when we look at people who don't have sexual attraction to children and try to figure out why would they do this thing that is so immoral and so harmful and so illegal, like you go to prison for decades for this behavior. One thing that is striking is not just people who may be operating in contexts of impunity, but also people who are surrounded by children to whom they're not biologically related, that seems to be a risk factor, and who are probably very unprepared for how to handle stray sexual thoughts that might occur when you're surrounded by kids. And so the teacher who offends against a student, the female teacher, this is a very gendered type of harm. It's mostly perpetrated by men against boys and girls. But women do offend sexually, and often in the context of teaching. What's going on there? And I think what's going on there is that for whatever reason, a particular teacher may be immature or facing other problems in their life, maybe mental health or substance use or financial issues, and comes to find the company of children who are very forgiving and very easy to please, much more compelling than the company of adults. And they didn't enter the teaching profession to offend or to find victims, but they may find themselves going down this path without a lot of forethought. And I think that's another way we could intervene and probably prevent a lot of harm from occurring.
Cool. We could speak about this all day, but we need to get to Q&A. But I do want to ask again, so one more thing. Like, what does the future look like for the Moore Center? I mean, again, it's been just over 10 years now. The Moore Center's been in operation. So what does the future look like, both for the Moore Center and just the field generally, of child sex abuse prevention?
Well, the field is exploding. So there's more perpetration prevention interventions today than there were 5 years ago. And I mean, a lot more. My colleague, Michael Cito, and I did a kind of scan of the universe of prevention interventions, and we identified more than 40. And we get emailed, every few weeks with some new intervention being developed. And we're beginning to evaluate several of those other interventions that we haven't developed, but that still need to kind of be held to the scientific lens of evaluation. And I'm really excited about this work. I'm absolutely astonished at the amount of resources, government resources, foundation resources, philanthropic resources that are going into prevention for the first time in history. So I think this is a critical moment in time. The field is exploding. As I said, I think in 5 or 10 years, we're going to have a lot of well-validated tools in our toolkit that effectively prevent harm from occurring to children, that keep children safe from child sexual abuse. The Moore Center is going to be part of that. We are leading it right now. We are going to be joined by a lot of other individuals and have been. I think we're going to stay in a very strong leadership capacity, both in the United States and around the world. We get consulted for addressing and preventing child sexual abuse, and I think that's going to continue to be the case. So I think, we have a lot of work in front of us, but we are absolutely up to the challenge.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. And with that, let's open the floor to some questions. I'm getting some fed through to me right now, and they're really interesting. I want to start with a question from Meredith. Hello, Meredith. Okay, Elizabeth, in what way, if any, are children involved in the development of these programs?
So that's a great question. You know, we know from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and other conventions that if you're going to develop an intervention for children, children need to have a voice in the intervention development. So we certainly, when we are recruiting kids into our research studies, we work to get their understanding of how did this go, how did they experience the intervention. We revise interventions based on their feedback and the feedback of parents, which is also absolutely as important. For our Baltimore City project, we had a parents advisory board. You know, it can be tricky to talk with for researchers to talk with kids about child sexual abuse. We also really need to give parents the tools and skills and knowledge they need to be able to have effective conversations with their kids about appropriate sexual behavior and avoiding harmful sexual behavior, and about disclosing harmful sexual behavior that they may be experiencing.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of a bit of a follow-up question. I mean, in regards to, this is from Faith. Is there a risk of stigmatizing or criminalizing the people who seek help?
Well, they're already stigmatized. We don't really have to worry about that. That's been done. Destigmatizing is part of the effort in front of us. If we want people to avoid engaging in harmful behavior, it's helpful to help them feel supported. So we want to stigmatize the behavior. We don't want to stigmatize people. So we absolutely want to stigmatize sexual abuse of children and keep that illegal and heavily stigmatized behavior. But yeah, we have to be careful. There's mandatory reporting laws that we have to be mindful of in our country and most other countries. And one of the reasons we made Help Wanted an online self-help intervention where you don't interact with the therapist is so people could go and access the material safely, and there wouldn't be a concern about reporting requirements. It is difficult if you have offended already. If you want to go get help, you certainly can. And we recommend that people do. At the same time, the therapist is going to be a mandated reporter. So anyone you get help from is going to be a mandated reporter, and you could face some very, very significant legal consequences. So, you know, there are some countries that do this differently. In Germany, if you seek help from a therapist, the therapist is actually bound by stronger confidentiality laws than mandatory reporting laws, and so they can get treatment in the context of confidential therapy. I think we need to come up with something more nuanced than what Germany does and that what the US does right now to meet somewhere in the middle where people can access treatment without automatically facing 10 years in prison, but still have accountability be part of the solution.
This is a question from Jones. Are there opportunities for community engagements and prevention work for laypersons? And if so, how can we get involved in the work?
I think there's opportunity for everyone. If you are already volunteering in any kind of youth-serving capacity, whether it's as a coach or an assistant coach for your kids' sport, if it's you know, in the arts, kids' arts, if it's in your own religious community, there are opportunities to speak up to make sure that the organizations are aware of child sexual abuse and that they're doing what they ought to do to prevent it from occurring, that there is a strategy for reporting concerns that complies with the law. We have online a kind of a leadership desk guide that provides strategies for organizations to prevent and address child sexual abuse, as does the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So I think just being aware, and, you know, if you have kids or nephews and nieces, talking with them, you know, asking kids about their experiences. When a child's being sexually abused, they don't come home with some sign around their neck that they're being abused. Often kids are really good at hiding it, or may even not be aware that what's happening is harmful or non-normative. And so just asking kids, you know, we ask kids how they're doing at school. We ask them if anyone's been bullying them. We don't ask kids, has anyone touched your genitals or made you touch theirs? I use clearer language, penis and vagina, with my kids. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but having really clear, calm discussions with kids and just checking in with them every once in a while, I think would both prevent harm and uncover it at much early stages. And I'd love to see parents and other adults get much more comfortable having these kinds of conversations with kids.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm just going to jump in with my own questions. Sorry, there's more questions coming and they're great, but I want to get to them. But like you mentioned your own kids and you kind of already half answered this. I think a lot of parents, and I've certainly heard this, I'm not a parent myself, but you certainly are. And what can parents do? What do you do with your children? How do you speak to your kids, both about risk of being sexually victimized and also about perpetrating sexual harm themselves?
Right. So one thing I don't do is use that kind of language, victimization and perpetration, because they're kids and you don't want to feel like potential perpetrators. That'll shut and very few people identify as a victim. So, many folks don't like to be categorized by the one bad thing that happened to them or the worst thing they ever did. I have two boys, they're 5 years apart. They're 14 and 19 now, and they're doing great. But starting at a very early age, we called a penis a penis and butts, and we talked about vaginas, even though neither of them, so we use the right language so that, and part of the rationale for that is that if someone is touching someone's penis, the kid can come tell you that or disclose it to a teacher perhaps, and not use some idiosyncratic terminology that might not get noticed. So that's a really early step, not treating penises and butts and breasts as inherently off topic or off limits or weird or uncomfortable, but just being matter of fact when talking about those as you do elbows and tummies. So those are early things. And then as kids are going outside the home for care, talking with the care providers to make sure that they have plans in place, for preventing accidental injury and intentional injury of, sexual abuse. Nobody's going to be yelling at your kid, those kinds of things. And also letting caregivers know that you are going to be talking to your kid about these things. And every once in a while, when my children were younger, and even today with the 14-year-old, I'll ask, hey, has anybody tried to touch your penis or had you touch yours? And they're like, nope. And now they roll their eyes and I'm like, no, mom. But they know that, if they tell me this, I'm not going to fly off the handle or freak out. Because even if you get upset, it's going to make them feel like they did something wrong. So you have to be cool. You have to be able to ask these questions. And if the answer is yes, you have to be able to keep your cool and have a plan. And then, as the boys got older, we also talked about when you are sexual with someone else, how do we make sure that that's mutual? What is okay right now? Is holding hands okay right now? Is kissing, is sexual touching, is intercourse okay? And as they got older and those things did become more okay, we talked about how do you make sure what you're doing is wanted by the other person, and just having conversations. It's not one conversation, it's a series. They went to schools that had great sex ed, which was wonderful, but parents can also look and see what their schools are doing for sex ed. And now there's online materials that are specifically for parents to address all of these issues. A lot of our partners at organizations like Darkness to Light or Committee for Children, the National Children's Alliance. These are resources, and they have a lot of resources for families, as do we, on their websites.
Mm-hmm. Actually relates to a couple of questions that just came through. The first is from Linda. When will the universal middle school program be ready to go widespread? And kind of like a follow-up question to that, like you mentioned sex ed, your sons were lucky to have good sex ed. Linda, sex ed in schools seem to be going the opposite direction. How can we make inroads when the tide is going in the other direction?
Well, it depends the state you live in, right? Although I will say, even in some very conservative states, I lived in South Carolina for 18 years, and they actually have excellent sex education in their public schools. They keep it under the wire, though. So they do not highlight that. What was the first part of the question, Luke? I've lost track.
About
RBY, responsible behavior with younger children. That's the name of our school-based, our universal prevention, school-based intervention, responsible behavior with younger children. So we're under review right now for a grant that, if it gets funded, would support a very large-scale randomized controlled trial. And if the results from that trial are supportive, then we're ready for prime time. We may also, it looks like we might have some opportunities to implement responsible behavior with younger children in some middle schools, even absent funding from the National Institute of Health in this case, to begin to get some stronger signals of whether this intervention works. Or it's not usually as easy as does it work or not, but what works and what needs work in it. But I think over the next few years is what we're looking at for this intervention. And as I mentioned, there's already 2 interventions that are out there that are effective at preventing they don't address younger problem sexual behavior with younger kids, but they address peer sexual behavior. Shifting boundaries is the name of one, and safe dates is the name of the other.
Cool. We've got a handful of minutes left. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 questions. This one comes from Trinity. What was the statistic that you mentioned at the beginning that said children are more at risk for sexual abuse by peers? Can you please elaborate? Are kids more at risk from peers than adults for sexual abuse?
So what we know in the United States, in Australia, and Israel, and Canada, those are the places for which I have figures, is that when you survey survivors of child sexual abuse, when you survey general population samples of individuals, and some percentage of whom, maybe a quarter of whom, will be, if they're about a quarter of girls, about 5 to 10% of boys are at risk of being sexually abused prior to the age of 18 in the United States. Globally, it's 1 in 9, about 12% of all children have been sexually abused in one form or another. And yeah, in the United States and elsewhere, about 70% of those cases were perpetrated by another child under the age of 18, and usually within a couple years age of the survivor. And I think one way to conceptualize this is that we are all at most risk, and we're all at high risk of making mistakes and bad decisions when we are first learning a complex behavior. And there is nothing more complex than intimacy and sex. And so kids are bad at it when they get started. They don't know that younger kids are off limits. They absolutely don't. They don't know what consent is. I think we all have examples of adults who don't seem to have a good understanding of what consent is. So we have to do a better job of purposefully educating pubescent kids for whom this is most relevant, about these concepts, about who's an appropriate partner, who's not. What is consent? What is consent not? What are the laws? And in that way, I think we would really prevent a lot of harm. Adults, know the rules mostly, and for them, interventions are going to need to be different than just recognizing that they're developmentally not there yet. So we need different interventions for kids and adults.
Gotcha. Okay, so bringing it back to adults, or maybe kids and adults, this is a really interesting question that came through from Chris. How can the religious community participate in the development of protection efforts?
Say that again.
Cool. How can the religious community participate in the development of protection efforts? Or how can the community just help out in terms of CSA prevention?
Yeah, well, fortunately, a lot of religious communities, and this includes the Catholic Church, certainly in the United States, have taken steps to prevent and address child sexual abuse. So a lot of the grand jury reports that we see, really, the emphasis has been on older cases that absolutely still need to be held accountable, and those survivors deserve their day in court, and they deserve justice. But we have seen a lot of organizations take meaningful steps to prevent harm from occurring in the first place. For example, at big Boys and Girls Clubs of America, they hired an architect like 30 years ago to try to figure out how do we make our spaces safer. So strategies include putting windows in interior doors so that you can keep adult-child interactions observable and interruptible. The Boy Scouts, back in the late 80s, faced with massive lawsuits, instituted a rule where there had to be 2 adults around if there was a child present, there had to be 2 or more adults present to try to reduce the likelihood of adults preying on children in the context of scouting activities. They implemented other rules like no co-sleeping with scouts. Big Brothers Big Sisters, which has a mentoring model. So you want the intention is for an adult or an older adolescent to be with a younger kid. They do a lot of training, and then they follow up with the kid and with the parents to make sure there's not bad behavior happening. So there are many strategies to prevent harm from occurring in the first place that include, first and foremost, signaling from the leadership on down that child well-being is the most important consideration here. Nothing else matters. If it's a sports team, winning comes second to child well-being. If it's a religious setting, everything else comes second to child well-being. Schools, everything comes second to child well-being, and getting the leadership to say it and to act it, and then following up with real policies that implement professional and caring behaviors with children, and that provide avenues for reports to be made, for kids to be heard. Those are among the strategies.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. Like everything comes second. It's a really easy thing to keep at the front of your mind, right?
Yeah, we think so.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. And I apologize to everybody. We have some amazing questions coming through that we didn't get a chance to get to. But there are 2 more Hopkins at Home sessions coming up. And many of these questions actually fit in with the upcoming talks. So yeah, it looks like we're out of time, and I would like to once again thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing your time today and discussing this really important topic which affects everybody. I'd like also to thank all of our attendees for joining and encourage you to register and attend the second part of our series next week, featuring Rebecca Fix, an assistant professor of mental health and a close collaborator with the Moore Center. A follow-up email will be shared with you all that will include a recording of the program and a link to a schedule of upcoming virtual and in-person events. And we hope to see you soon at future Moore Center and Hopkins at Home events. Thanks again, Elizabeth, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Luke, and thanks, everybody.